Hi there and welcome to the channel, and in this video I'll be talking about André Gide's 1909 novel Strait is the Gate, which I read in this rather charming vintage edition, translation by Dorothy Bussy. Now before we proceed any further, I wish to note that this novel bears the unique distinction of being the first to make the disappointed man cry. Yes, in over 40 years of reading, I've never before had that experience, and here I was taken completely unawares by a single line in the final scene, which unleashed a tidal wave of emotion. So I just wish to note at the outset that this is a deeply moving novel. Okay, before we come on to the story, let's have a brief biographical sketch of the author himself. André Gide was born in 1869 into a middle-class Parisian family. His father, a professor of law, died when Gide was only 11 years old, and he was then raised in isolated conditions in Normandy. He published his first novel at the age of 21, and over the course of a long career produced not only many more novels, but plays, travel writing, and literary criticism. Openly homosexual, Gide was an inspiration for many gay writers of the time, and his works broke new ground in their portrayal of same-sex desires. He was also critically lauded and was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947, just 4 years before his death. So there's a brief history of the man, and now we're ready to talk about the story. As an example of fictionalized autobiography, this novel begins with the fictional narrator Jerome explaining how and why he's assembled the written account we're about to read, which traces the lives of 4 characters: Jerome himself, Alissa and Juliet, his 2 cousins, and Abel, a mutual friend of all 3. What follows is a narrative which reconstructs the past not only from memory, but also by drawing upon materials such as correspondence between Jerome and Alissa and entries from the latter's journal. The narrative proper begins shortly after the death of Jerome's father. He's aged around 12 or so at the time, and the early chapters focus on his visits to his uncle with his mother and her female companion, whether in the town at Easter or at their place in the country during summer, and each of these visits provides a chance to reunite with his 3 cousins, Alissa, Juliet, and Robert, and 3 events of crucial significance occur during these visits, the first of which is an unsolicited physical encounter with his Aunt Lucille, who delights in making the young Jerome feel thoroughly uncomfortable, and I'll just read you the account of this incident. One day I went into the drawing room to fetch a book. She was there. I was on the point of going away again when she called me back, she who as a rule never seemed to see me. "Why do you run away so fast, Jerome? Are you afraid of me?" With a beating heart I drew near, forced myself to smile, put out my hand. She took my hand with one of hers, and with the other stroked my cheek. "How badly your mother dresses you, you poor little thing," she said. At that time I used to wear a sort of sailor suit with a large collar, which my aunt began pulling about. "Sailor collars are worn much more open," said she, undoing a button of my shirt. "There, see if that doesn't look better," and taking out her little mirror, she drew my face down to hers, passed her bare arm around my neck, put her hand into my shirt, asked me laughingly if I was ticklish, went on, "Father." I started so violently that my shirt tore across, and with a flaming face I fled, as she called after me, "Oh, the little stupid." I rushed away to the other end of the kitchen garden, and there I dipped my handkerchief into a little tank, put it to my forehead, washed, scrubbed, my cheeks, my neck, every part of me the woman had touched. The second incident occurs 2 years later and again features Aunt Lucille. Jerome returns unannounced to his uncle's house and stumbles into an unpleasant domestic scene. The door of his aunt's bedroom is open, and inside, in the presence of Juliet and Robert, she is entertaining a young military officer, smoking, chatting, and making disparaging remarks about his uncle. Jerome, appalled, goes off and searches for Alissa and, finding her in a highly distressed state, seeks to comfort her. "Oh, Jerome, why have you come back?" I bent down to kiss her. Her face was bathed in tears. My whole life was decided by that moment. Even to this day I cannot recall it without a pang of anguish. Doubtless I understood very imperfectly the cause of Alissa's wretchedness, but I felt intensely that it was far too strong for her little quivering soul, for her fragile body, shaken with sobs. I remained standing beside her, while she remained on her knees. I could express nothing of the unfamiliar transport of my breast, but I pressed her head against my heart and pressed my lips to her forehead, while my whole soul came flooding through them. Drunk with love, with pity, with an indistinguishable mixture of enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, and virtue, I appealed to God with all my strength. I offered myself up to him, unable to conceive that existence could have any other object than to shelter this child from fear, from evil, from life. The final incident comes just 2 days later, when Jerome and Alissa attend church, and during the sermon, the priest uses the words, "Strait is the gate." Now, if you're not religious, these words come from the Gospel of Matthew and concern the difficult path that leads to everlasting life. It's a phrase that is often cited in literary works. Indeed, I'll give you just one mention here from Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well. Act 4, Scene 5. I am for the house with the narrow gate, which I take to be too little for pomp to enter. Some that humble themselves may, but the many will be too chill and tender, and they'll be for the flowery way that leads to the broad gate and the great fire. So, just as Alissa's distress had a huge impact on Jerome, these words have an enormous impact on Alissa. They will shape not only her tragedy, but the individual tragedies which befall the other three characters. Okay, I'll stop there. If you want to know what happens next, you're going to have to read this novel for yourself. Instead, I'm going to turn my attention toward what makes Strait is the Gate such a great book. And in doing so, I'm going to touch upon 3 points. Firstly, how this book reduced me to a sobbing mess. Secondly, its thoroughly modern treatment of identity. And thirdly, the many literary allusions that greatly enrich the story's themes. Now, as I noted at the start of this video, my strong emotional response to this novel really did take me by surprise. I thought I'd already got through all of it, and then it was right on the last page where there was a single sentence that just triggered this outpouring of emotion. How did that happen? Well, I've had a chance to reflect, and I believe it's to do with the intimacy of this book, not only the intimate nature of the narrative, but also of the narration. There's something about the way in which Jerome will say, I'm taking out the packet of letters between myself and Alissa now, or I'm thumbing through her journal. And you also learn about the way in which the letters return to him in the narrative and how he came into possession of the journal. So they mean much more than just their contents. And then there is also the restrained nature of his narration, which allows a lot of emotion to be bubbling up under the surface. And then there was this trigger in the final scene that just opened up my emotional floodgates, because it just showed that this wasn't just a heartbreaking story for Jerome, but what it had done to one of the other characters too. So that is why this novel packed such an emotional punch. A second strength of this novel is its thoroughly modern treatment of identity, and nowhere is this more evident than in the treatment of Alissa. Alissa at one point instructs Jerome and points out the fact that he is still in love with a memory of her as a young girl, and that she is no longer that person, and therefore there's no reason for him to still love her. Jerome, however, clings faithfully to this memory, no matter how different Alissa becomes. Then there's also the identities in their correspondence, because when they write to one another, Alissa and Jerome, they are able to unfurl more of themselves, and Alissa in particular sees this as the fullest expression of their identities, and for her this spiritual correspondence is enough, whereas Jerome is always treating the letters as if they are preparatory to his next physical encounter with Alissa, no matter how disappointing these inevitably prove to be. And then finally, Alissa is so intent on severing herself from Jerome and killing his love for her that she transforms her wardrobe, her bedroom, even her choice of reading matter, all in a fruitless attempt to liberate Jerome from his attachment to her. And so, despite this novel having been published over a century ago, it suggests there is a much longer prehistory of contemporary questions of identity than one might have supposed. Lastly, this novel contains many literary allusions, and here I'll just focus on the resonances of the characters' names. Now, the name Alissa carries no particular symbolic weight. However, the first time we encounter her, Jerome identifies her as his Beatrice, Beatrice to his Dante, and this really does describe the dynamics of their relationship well, at least from Jerome's point of view. Alissa is the vision of female perfection in whose presence he wishes to spend eternity. He cannot bear to be separated from her. Alissa, for her part, sees Jerome more as Saint Jerome, the ascetic, and she herself as a female ascetic, and she does not wish to play guide to Jerome/Dante. Juliet, for her part, prefers romantic to divine love, and in this respect she resembles Juliet of Shakespeare's play. Abel should play Romeo to Juliet. Indeed, he'd be happy to do so. However, circumstances intervene, and so, like his biblical namesake, he is the good son who never achieves his destiny. Instead, Juliet and Abel part in sorrow, and each of them assumes a worldly existence which is not as satisfying as the one they'd hoped for. And so you don't have to be aware of these literary allusions as you're reading, but for me, as a literary scholar, I really did find that added a lot more complexity to this novel. So there you have it, a wonderful, wonderful read. If you feel like a good cry, I strongly recommend it. But for now, all that remains is for me to bid you farewell in the customary fashion. So until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.